Well, thank you very much for can you hear me? Is it working? Well, thanks for turning up. It is actually working. I'm not entirely sure. It is working. Right. Thanks for turning up. As Deborah said, it's a very pleasantly larger audience than we expected, and slightly more daunting for being that. But thanks very much for turning up. My guest, Pavel Andreev, is the Deputy Bureau Chief for Novosti, a journalist, and he's been here for a long time, and he's an expert on Russo-British relations. Oksana Antonenko is a distinguished member of the ISS and a writer of several books on Eastern Europe and the Caucasus as well. Damien McElroy is a foreign affairs correspondent for The Telegraph. We normally meet in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and which is one of the things we'll go into, the fact that Western journalists like us, a lot of them ended up in Georgia in a very unexpected war, and frankly without perhaps the background knowledge we should have had. Roy Allison teaches at the LSE. Before that he was at Chatham House. Another distinguished analyst who has also written a number of books. Now, very briefly, just to start off, I suppose it is slightly surprising, you might think, that we are sitting here in 2008, in September, talking about a short but a fairly important war where you had Russian jets bombing a city in Europe. But is it surprising? The Russian commander said to us, asked us in Gori when we were there, why is this more surprising than NATO jets bombing a Western capital 10 years ago? So perhaps we have been a bit slow in seeing how this particular conflict took root. Perhaps we're a bit slow in recognizing the Russian anger at the way they perceive they have been treated by the West, and perhaps what happens in the future is partly to do with this unpreparedness on the part of many of us in the West, especially the media. If we can start off with Oksana, and she will give her view for a few minutes, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you. Well, when we discussed at the beginning how we're going to divide our opening remarks, I suggested that I will maybe try to speak a little bit about the conflict itself, seeing it very much on the core ground level. And as the previous speaker said, that it came completely unexpected for many Western journalists. It certainly came as completely predictable and expected for anyone who has been involved on the ground looking at the conflicts both in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I spent 3 years trying to set up and mediate the informal Georgian South Ossetian peace process, which was indeed in the last 10 years the only real bilateral peace process where the Georgians and the South Ossetians were sitting around the table and discussing both their concerns, their fears, but also their expectations for the future. And in 2006 and 2005, as I was in the middle of this process, that certainly looked to me as a conflict which sooner or later is going to erupt in violence, and a conflict where neither side has been seeing any prospect of peaceful resolution of this conflict. And I think as much as maybe the journalists and many of the politicians were not aware about the coming storm around this conflict, there is no doubt in my mind that all the key international players that have been also involved on the ground for many years observing this conflict and helping to resolve this conflict, and we are talking, of course, particularly in South Ossetia, the OSCE, but also the European Union, which for a number of years now been participating in the formal peace process, certainly have seen for many, many years and many, many months before this conflict erupted, very clear signs that we were all heading towards the conflict escalation. And let me just tell you a few words about what really is at the core of this conflict. And what is in the core of this conflict is an interethnic conflict which has a long history, which stretches over centuries. And just to say kind of a story of one family in South Ossetia who I know, who has lost during the first Georgian Ossetian war in the 1918 two sons in their family, who have lost another son of their family in the 1992 when this war erupted immediately after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and who have again lost a member of their family when this war erupted on August the 7th, when the Georgian troops have decided to use massive force against the civilian population in Tskhinvali. And I think this is just one example of how, for generations, people who lived in that part of the Caucasus certainly tried to find a way for their nation, for their ethnic group, which certainly constitutes a minority within Georgia, but certainly also aspires for safety, security, and predictability in their life, to struggle to survive physically in something which has been a prolonged conflict. So when we talk about this war in terms of Russian-Georgian war, certainly that what it has become as Russia intervened after August the 7th. But one has to remember that the core of it is a very long history of inter-ethnic violence which has not been resolved. Now just a few words about how the conflict was, the prehistory, the prelude to the current violence. We have seen after the Rose Revolution in Georgia, there was a real momentum and expectations, I think, both in Georgia, among the international community, but I will even say among the people living in both Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that maybe now, with a new government in place, which has not been involved in the wars of the early 1990s, we could really move towards a genuine peace process. And these expectations were very genuine. I believe, I remember I was there in 2004 in the spring, when people were seriously considering that now maybe we're going to turn the page and we will genuinely engage in the peace process and find a way for the Georgians and Ossetians and Georgians and the Abkhaz to coexist. But unfortunately, those hopes and expectations were shattered just a few months after the Rose Revolution. In the summer of 2004, this was the first time when the Georgian troops actually moved into South Ossetia and were shelling houses in Tskhinvali once again. And at that time, luckily, this conflict was contained, and Georgia pulled out its troops without massive casualties. But that was a time also when the international community actually managed to seriously intervene to be able to contain this conflict. We've seen a very strong reaction from Washington. We have seen very, very strong reaction from Europe, saying that this conflict simply cannot go on. And after that, unfortunately, all the hopes about the peace process were shattered. So we had for many years a situation of no war, no peace, where there was no genuine peace process, where the escalation of conflict was only going on. We've seen people being armed on both sides. We've seen the South Ossetians increasingly being insecure, and the Georgians proposing the peace process, the peace initiatives, which unfortunately always been unilateral proposals and have never been developed jointly with South Ossetians. So as a result of that, by 2007, it was very clear that no peaceful resolution will be found. And at that very crucial moment, when both sides, both Georgians and the Ossetians, I believe, arrived to the conclusion that in the foreseeable future we will not have a peaceful resolution. While at the same time, of course, on the Georgian side, there was a very clear promise for the restoration of territorial integrity, which President Saakashvili has made when he came to power, that the military solution could be put back on the agenda. And that when we have seen rearmament on both sides, we have seen the escalation of violence almost on a daily basis for months before August 7th. We have seen exchanges of fire, civilians being evacuated. We have seen weapons being brought in the conflict zone. And all of that was happening while the international community, the international mediation, the international mediators, the international monitors who were present on the ground did absolutely nothing. Seeing very clear signs of early warning, to be able to translate this early warning into early action. I believe very strongly that should we have had an emergency EU summit, not in September, but actually in early July, should we had OSCE very seriously raising this issue on the very top of the political agenda, and a serious effort was made to make both sides sign a non-resumption of hostilities agreement, I think we could have avoided this war. But when the war actually started in August 7th, this was a time when, again, in the first hours of the war, there was almost no response from the international community. There was almost no response. We had a chance to meet with President Putin a few weeks ago in Sochi, and he was, Prime Minister Putin, sorry, in Sochi, and he was telling this story, which I think was very interesting. He said that around 10 o'clock in the morning on the 8th, he phoned Bush, and he said to him, the war is starting. Should we do something to contain it? And apparently, according to Putin, Bush said, yes, nobody wants the war, and we communicated it very clearly to Saakashvili, and we're going to do something to stop it. And when 8 hours later they met again at the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, and Putin asked him, so what is going on? What is the response from the international community? It became very evident that even a phone call was not made. And it took European Union 12 hours to even issue a statement. That was a time when the conflict was escalating, when the Russian tanks were coming through the Rocky Tunnel, when the war was breaking out, when civilians were shelled, and we had no reaction. The OSCE monitors simply left the region. And of course, they have no mandate to be there during the conflict escalation. But again, we have not seen any determined response to intervene. So what I want to say, I guess in my opening remarks, that sadly, for all of us who watch this conflict unfold on the ground, it is very clear that the conflict was entirely predictable and entirely preventable, but we all have failed and our international institutions have failed. And now the conflict, again, the ethnic dimension of this conflict, the Georgian Ossetian dimension has been forgotten, and we only are now talking about the kind of Russian-Western dynamics or the Georgian-Russian dynamics. But until we solve the problem of relationship between the Georgians and Ossetians, the Georgians, the Abkhaz, and find a way for them to coexist and live in peace together, we cannot move on. And therefore, in that sense, I believe that the recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia by Russia was a big mistake, because what we have done now, we froze the conflict once again. The conflict is frozen. And no security guarantees for people living either in Abkhazia or in the buffer zones can be provided until a common agreement is reached between the sides of this conflict.
Thank you, Oksana. Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting and illuminative discourse on the background. Now, Damien, I mean, you were one of many journalists, and I've never seen such a media circus since, I suppose, Baghdad in 2003. Hundreds of journalists descending in Tbilisi, and as I said earlier on, not many of them really with deep intrinsic knowledge of what lay behind this conflict. Do you think, Damien, that the media, the Western media, which you're a part of, did anything like enough to A, try and find out the truth about what happened, and B, to explain the situation to the readers in the West?
I think a good point to start this would be where Oksana left off, which is that the world was clearly caught on the hop by this conflict, but also driving around those fields and winding country roads of South Ossetia, it was quite clear that it was always going to be ludicrous to think that NATO Western soldiers were going to be fighting there against an invading force. It just didn't seem right. So as media injected into this situation where there is suddenly a Russian punch through, and where it claims to have a cause, where the Georgian government claims to be repulsing it, and you arrive, what did we arrived 18 hours after it all started, and a lot has gone on under the bridge by then. And you desperately scramble around to try and get set up for these things. And you don't know when you're doing it how long it's going to last. Now, in this case, it was over pretty quickly. There was several components. The Georgian army stopped fighting really within 2 days. Then it was a matter of spreading out of Russian troops and their allies. So we had to go probing what we could do within that situation where they were spreading out, they were beginning to mount roadblocks. We didn't know how volatile various bits of the military were. We did know that the Russian troops that were in there appeared to be very well disciplined and quite professional. But they were also backed by auxiliaries of a type that are familiar all around the world. And we had to figure out if they were going to be well behaved. There was a deluge of information from the Georgian government. Colleagues on the Russian side had a sort of mirror image of information, if not quite as much, but certainly the Ministry of Defense claims were probably the equal of the Georgian claims from the Ministry of the Interior. So you had that kind of swirl of information. Now, did we do as well as we could have done? Well, I think we probably did better than French diplomats who negotiated a completely haphazard ceasefire agreement that was virtually useless. And that allowed the situation to be frozen for a month or more. The situation now is, though, that those areas are mono-ethnic, and it is practically inconceivable that can be reversed within current conditions. So you do have a situation where Russia has gone forward and it has consolidated its standing in a near neighbor, in a neighboring country. Now this has implications all around the Caucasus, and it is important we recognize that even if Russia never does this again, there are all sorts of countries like Azerbaijan, Armenia, Moldova, to go slightly outside the Caucasus, but that are affected by this. And yes, there was a fog of war, but yes, I would contend there was a relatively accurate depiction of what was actually happening on the ground. And actually, for the most part, it's the bigger picture of the impact of what both sides did. That's the important thing.
Thank you. And I think we can examine the media's effectiveness or not in questions on this. Roy, now, you're not here to defend the Georgians or the Georgian spokesman, but you are going to take an analytical view, possibly about Russian provocation, which led to this. Perhaps you'd like to start.
Yes, I'd like to make some points in three areas. One is the extent to which the Georgian claims, which initially seemed far-fetched, that in some way the Russian offensive was pre-planned and expected, have some basis. Secondly, the actual arguments and international legal justifications used by the Russians. And thirdly, what Russian motivations might have been, speculatively, to conduct a campaign of such scale and intensity. Taking the first, Oksana gave the background. Really, this is between the Georgians and South Ossetians, and there was a spiral of incidents, really from early July, back and forth. There were casualties on both sides. And we can argue about who was provoking whom. Certainly there were provocations. And on the 8th, the timeline of it is quite important, because the attack by the Georgian forces on Svinhali was generally accepted, actually precipitated a Russian response, a very quick and rapid, effective Russian response. But the Georgians act first. Now, even if the Russian reaction is dubious in terms of international law, the fact that the Georgians attacked first has undermined their case to a considerable extent. Now, what is certainly true is that Russian forces were ready and waiting, in the sense that they were logistically fully able to move at very short notice. There have been concentrated forces from well outside the North Caucasus military district have been concentrated, and they're ready on the other side of the border. Mostly the concentration took place during a military exercise that ended on the 2nd of August. But then one has to ask questions about how it is that they were in such a degree of readiness that they could roll down to Svinhali at virtually no notice. Russia sent 9,000 paratroopers into Abkhazia. Again, almost immediately fighting broke out in South Ossetia. The naval craft from the Black Sea Fleet were all loaded and waiting and went immediately. They'd been preloaded, and so they could take the troops and equipment off very quickly. You find, I mean, over 300 Russian planes were in action. 15,000 troops at least came down into South Ossetia. All of this does suggest, actually, that the Russians were expecting something at the time. The Georgians go further and claim the Russians had actually crossed the border. The only evidence, really, that does seem to now look more sure on that is the intercepts, the telephone intercepts, which the Georgians just last week managed to finally identify. These have not been denied by the Russians. They do indicate the Russian armour rolled through the rocky tunnel before the Georgian attack on Svinhali. The Russians say, well, perhaps it could be a peacekeeping troop rotation, but you have to give a month's advance notice of that, and there's no reason why the troops on the south of the rocky tunnel would have been surprised by this coming if it had been a part of regular rotation. It seems Russian armour had moved before. It could have been that Russia decided to make sure the defence of the south of the rocky tunnel as tensions were mounting. But if it did so certainly in violation of Georgian territorial integrity. Georgia may then have interpreted that as a full-scale Russian invasion, or it may have been one, but it's that catalyst, that period which leaves many questions really unanswered. But Russia was ready. Now, the readiness was not only to tackle Georgian troops or even to reverse Georgian advances in Svinhali, but something that enabled an occupation on a much wider scale in Abkhazia and then south of South Ossetia. So this raises questions, really. I suspect that the Russian General Staff planning, which went back some time, was such that if conflict took place, then they would not confine themselves to South Ossetia. They already decided that they would engage in a much wider, sweeping campaign, which would be to strategically destabilise Georgia. Now, there's plenty more evidence as what happened then, which suggests that may well have been a major objective. Now, as far as the Russian justification is concerned, I don't want to go through this in detail, but if you take them individually, what it amounts to is the fact that this was an act of realpolitik. It wasn't one that had much international legal basis. The strongest grounds would be self-defense on the grounds that the Russian peacekeeping contingent were actually attacked. But of course that could have been withdrawn, it could have been reinforced to some extent, there could have been a limited assistance, but the scale of the Russian response was disproportionate, even if you took a self-defense argument. As far as humanitarian intervention is concerned, this was being proposed by Lavrov. That does not stand up very well, considering that Georgians had to flee from South Ossetian villages. Russian forces allowed South Ossetians and other irregulars to force those residents out. In addition to which, humanitarianism doesn't seem to have been particularly characteristic of Russian military policy in the North Caucasus. If you consider Chechnya, tens of thousands of Russian citizens, and many of them ethnic Russians, were killed in that. There were not too many concerns there. The actual numbers killed in that initial offensive, the number of South Ossetians, well, the Russian figure has come down to 500 from 2,000. It seems Human Rights Watch suggests about 40. It's certainly not a genocide, the term that Putin used and then became part of the official discourse around Russia in no time at all. Lavrov said he then invoked the right to protect argument. The United Nations has been developing this concept, right to protect. This right to protect applies to your own citizens in your own borders. It does not apply to those outside your borders. So that actually is not a legal defence here. There are plenty of cases where countries choose to defend their citizens outside their borders. Those kind of interventions are quite a different kind. If you work through the various legal defences, they are rather weak. This was an exercise of realpolitik. Russia clearly is sending a message out that it will defend those that it defines as Russian citizens. The self-defense argument in defense of Russian citizens is there, but if you look comparatively, this is considered rather weak in those cases where countries do create citizens through the delivery of passports in large numbers and then choose to defend those citizens for one reason or another through coercive means. But the defence of Russian citizens has become a bit of a watchword. This is not anything new, I would just point that out. It has been in the discourse, it's been a Russian foreign policy priority for a long while back, going back to the early Yeltsin years. It's actually explicitly in the 1993 Russian military doctrine that the Russian armed forces, one of their purposes is to defend citizens. An earlier draft of that doctrine suggested even Russian speakers, but that wasn't included. Effectively, Yeltsin didn't do very much of this. So, in a way, this is not a new kind of Putin-type threat. It is something that's been integral to the Russian view of what it considers to be its interests.
At this point, I think, because of tight time schedule, and it's a very apt time to move on to Pavel. Now, Pavel is certainly not here as a spokesman for the Kremlin. He's a distinguished journalist, but perhaps Pavel can give something which we have lacked so far, which is the view from Moscow, although you weren't in Moscow at the time, as well as your own view as an analyst of the situation.
No, I'm a bit amazed that we're still discussing who was the first to enter the South Ossetian borders. Dan Fried couldn't explain that better than Roy Ellison to the Congress, and even Condoleezza Rice last week conceded that it was actually the Georgian troops who entered to South Ossetia first. But I would actually, I think Oksana's introduction was very good in a sense that she pointed out the unexpectedness of the war to the international community. For the Russians, I think it was very much expected. Everybody was prepared for it, not in a sense to start a war, but in a sense that the tensions were growing and the signals from the ground were received in Moscow, and obviously the response which was there was basically the only one response which Russia could provide in the circumstances that Grad missile shelling a peaceful town in the middle of the night. Now, another point which obviously made Russia to move where it did was obviously the response of the West, and as Oksana again depicted, explained the conversations between Prime Minister Putin and President Bush, there was a lack of response from the West, which made Russia to act the way it actually did. And before Russia actually introduced its forces, the first thing it did was it convened the Security Council of the United Nations, which showed its absolute paralyzed situation and inaptitude to do anything on the matter. Now, our topic today is actually all change in the Caucasus. So I actually think that we should also a bit change the discussion and move away from these timelines and tit-for-tat things, because there are much more significant implications both on the ground and in the in a broader geopolitical sense. And obviously for the South Ossetia and Abkhazia, I think the main implication, the main change is that now more security guarantees are given to these enclaves, that another onslaught like that would not going to happen. Of course, it's not 100% proof. That's the reality we have with the current Georgian government. But now South Ossetia and Abkhazia have also the European Union guarantees that that their security and their borders would not be violated by the Georgian troops. Now, I think the conflict had also very significant implication to Georgia itself, and particularly to the current Georgian government and Mr. Saakashvili. I think that it has lost quite significant part of its credibility and reliability for the wider world, and actually not even the world outside the West, the Western countries, but also to quite a lot of people in Europe and even in the US. So now having that in mind, obviously there will be much harder to get any progress on the situation because of that. Again, as the previous speakers already pointed out, there is a frozen situation that South Ossetia and Abkhazia basically got what they wanted. They had more security, the guarantees for their security, and the Georgians do not have now that any moral or legal leverage to advance their claims on the enclaves. Now, if you put that in a broader geopolitical sense, obviously the two main actors were Russia and the US. Well, Russia obviously surprised quite a lot of people in the West by its decisiveness. It was still very much, its foreign policy and the policies were still very much reactionary, but nobody could expect that the Russian reactions would be that decisive. And that's obviously set some kind of a milestone that Russia is still going forward on the path it has taken in the beginning of, at the end of the 1990s, in the beginning of 2000s, that it's going to defend itself, and it's not going to be a puppet or a poodle for any other foreign countries. But the last but not least is obviously the implications which the conflict in Georgia had for the U.S. position in the world. I think that the post-Cold War structure of the world order, a unipolar world where the American ambitions went global and were basically unchecked by any international body or any power. These have the conflict in Georgia showed that the U.S. has its limits, and obviously this is a significant milestone which will have to be reevaluated, and for the future American administration, that would be a crucial point of balancing out its not only its relations with Russia but also worldwide foreign policies.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you very much indeed. The floor is open to you. As Pavel pointed out, the title of this discussion is all change in the Caucasus, and I think we haven't really taken the broader view. We've been concentrating, perhaps understandably, on Georgia. So in your questions, do feel free, if you so want, to talk about the rest of the Caucasus and what this means, and also perhaps you'd care to look at what's been happening since Georgia. You've now got a Russian fleet sailing for the coast of Venezuela. There's an interesting call in the Financial Times last week set in Western Europe, where Russia is now seen as a threat, which it hasn't been seen for a long time. It has now joined the august company of North Korea, Iran, and the US as great dangers to the world. So the floor is, if you can possibly keep the questions short, that will be useful.
I think this question is directed first to Ray Ellison. I've read it, possibly even in the Telegraph, that South Ossetia is actually peopled in 2/3 proportion by those with a Russian passport. You actually mentioned that in your introduction, and I wonder if you could indicate why that might be, and then possibly what that might mean for the future.
Can we have perhaps the gentleman at the back as well? We'll take, I think, 3 questions each.
Difficult how to phrase a question. I'm sorry I missed the beginning, so if it's already been covered. Several points. I've spent the last, from the outbreak of this latest conflict, I spent the first few weeks phoning and emailing BBC, ITV, ITN, even Al Jazeera, trying to get them to broadcast truth that I was aware of from my contacts with Ossetia. And one has to wonder why the broadcast media would not broadcast the truth about what was happening out there. I think it's generally accepted now that Georgia were the first to move. The number of people killed by Georgia on that first night has been disputed by one of your panelists, but certainly my understanding is still that on that first night the Georgian troops moved in by night and razed 5 South Ossetian villages and killed some 2,000 people. The history of the area is very much that the South Ossetians never wished to be part of Georgia, neither did Abkhazia. It was a split forced on them by the Soviet Union.
We've got you.
Just coming to a bit of question. And so we've heard the Western media and governments talk about the territorial integrity of Georgia, but it's a nonsense. And I'd like to hear some comment on that. Those two regions were forced into Georgia against their wish. The second question is, we've heard so much about Georgia and Russia. What in the media? What about the people of South Ossetia and Abkhazia?
Thank you very much. Can we have just one more question in this tranche, please?
Mark Mullen, the portrayal of the events as a sort of ethnic war between Ossetians and Georgians, I think, is undercut somewhat by the fact that there are more Ossetians living in Georgia outside of Ossetia than there are within in Ossetia, and much of the Georgian Olympic team, for example, was Ossetian, and therefore Russia being the sort of regional adult to come in and provide guarantees to those areas. But if that's the case, why has Russia so persistently prevented an international entity that they do not have veto power over from entering those areas? Currently, it's the EU. I mean, the OSCE and the UN in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, respectively, release very little information. I mean, of the information that they have and that they gather, very little of it is available to the public. Because the Russian seats there always seem to veto those reports going out. You can see that with the shooting down of drones, for example, and the investigations of those. Whereas the EU, there's no Russian veto, and they're not allowed in pretty aggressively, considering the agreements that Sarkozy and Medvedev have made.
Okay. Well, Chris, perhaps. If we can start, I mean, there's Roy. I mean, there's a direct challenge to your version of how many were killed in the Georgian assault in Shin Valley. Perhaps you'd care to address that, and the question of Russians handing out passports in Ossetia. Again, I mean, any one of you can answer that. And the last point from the gentleman over there: why are the Russians not allowing independent foreign firms in there? So, Roy, if you just answer the question about the, please, the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, the 2000 figure is simply propaganda. It was a figure that was brought out within days, when there was no possibility for any actor to realistically come to any calculation of those losses. The official Russian figure, official now, has come down to about 500. This is in the North Caucasus authorities carrying out their own investigation. The Human Rights Watch investigation was based on interviewing doctors and medical staff in Svinhali, and that's about 50, with about 300 more wounded. So that's all I can say on that matter. I don't think it helps too much, but I think that there were some of these figures: 2,000 dead, genocide and so on that came out in the first few days on the Russian side, which became part of the kind of official discourse. And it was unhelpful without more information about what's happening on the ground. I was asked about the passport holders. Should I? Just
yes, and then we can move on. If you can answer
on passport holders, well, this is seems now a phenomenon that will be looked at more closely, because the Ukrainian authorities, for example, are very concerned at the moment about what they see as large numbers of passports being given out, Russian passports in the Crimea, and they've got no figures really on how many dual citizens, which are not allowed under Ukrainian law, there actually are. So they've been asking Russians for clarification on this. In South Ossetia, there was a further tranche of passports given out quite recently, and one has to ask really why there was such a priority to give these out at that time. One of the characteristics of the South Ossetian administration was its sort of symbiotic relationship with the Russian security services. And I mean, one illustration, one just factual point to indicate that, when the commander of the 58th Army, coming from North Caucasus in this offensive, was wounded because he was at the forefront, his replacement, the new commander, is a man who was 6 months Deputy Defence Minister of South Ossetia this year. So this kind of shuttling back and forth suggests, that South Ossetia is not operating autonomously in that way.
That's fine. Can we just move on from there? The question of passports, you wrote about it, Damien. Did you come across a lot of people in Ossetia who had said to you that they've suddenly been given Russian passports? Was that a huge phenomenon?
There is an awful lot of allegations about this. There are a lot of people who wanted it to be true, even though they were opposed to Russia, because that would give some depiction of the calculated and cynical nature of the Russian campaign. I certainly did meet people who were being recruited for Russian passports. I have seen evidence, which I believe, of subsequent passports that were shipped into the area. But I also put a discount on the idea that this was a blanket effort. I think there were batches, and they were fairly industrial-sized batches. But the important thing here is there were sufficient numbers of Russian passport holders in that area, people who were therefore entitled to pension payment from Russia, to give Russia a reason and an explanation for its interest in the area. And that is irreversible. You have otherwise an unsustainable enclave, a tiny little place, which wouldn't matter to anyone. But it does get Russia over the mountains and down in an area where it wants to exert influence. So yeah, that was happening.
So for you to Oksana.
Can I also actually touch on the issue of passports, because I know it so well, this whole issue, because I spent so much time in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in the 1990s when those passports actually started to be issued. And seen it for myself, actually, how it was issued and to whom it was issued. Well, can you imagine, just imagine for yourself, people in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, after the first war, which happened in 92, 93 in South Ossetia, 93, 94 in Abkhazia, for 15 years existed without passports. Can you imagine? How can people exist without passports? In Abkhazia in the 1997, there was a time when Russia was still actually enforcing the blockade on Abkhazia. In 96, 97, 98, Russia was blockading Abkhazia altogether. And in fact, South Ossetia mostly as well, as a part of the CIS decision at that time after the first war. And the Abkhaz authorities asked the UN, could you please issue us UN non-citizen documents? There are lots of non-citizens who live in many countries, including in Europe. And there is a UN special green card which can be issued without identifying the citizenship. Because of course, none of those people, either in Abkhazia or South Ossetia, could take or wanted to take Georgian passports. They just went through a very horrendous war in the early 1990s when thousands of people were affected. Hundreds of people died, hundreds of thousands of people displaced on both sides. And of course, from Abkhazia, mostly Georgians. But people lived through that trauma. So of course, they would not go go to Tbilisi to apply for passports. So the United Nations was explicitly asked to issue special documents, and the response was no. So only in 1999, for the first time, people were started to receive Russian passports. And they were started to receive Russian passports for two main reasons. The first main reason is because they simply had nothing to live on. People who lived for 10 years, you know, they're normal human beings in a situation of complete blockade, with no capacity to travel outside of where they lived because they had no passports. The Soviet passports were no longer recognized. They needed some document which they can show to even travel across the border. They couldn't live in this tiny enclave all their lives. And secondly, because at that time, you know, the South Ossetian government was completely bankrupt. Abkhaz government was completely bankrupt because Russia was still enforcing the blockade. And the Russian passport for pensioners gave the opportunity for them to receive $200 a month pension. And in fact, in the year early 2000 and after the Rose Revolution, we were raising this issue with the Georgian government all the time, saying, well, if, you know, Georgians in Gali, by the way, in Abkhazia, 60,000 Georgians have returned, and they live there still. And in fact, during this recent war, none of them were expelled by the Abkhaz. They still live there. And these Georgians, many of them have Russian passports. They're not Abkhaz. They're not South Ossetians. They're Georgians. And the reason they have Russian passports is because the Russian pension at the moment is $300. The Georgian pension is $30. And it was raised 10 times under Saakashvili. It was $3 in the Rose Revolution. So if you were a pensioner who living in a situation of complete blockade, would you not take a passport which actually pay you every month $300 to be able to survive? And that was not a cunning plan of the Russians, because in late 1990s, early 2000, nobody was talking about any potential for intervention for Russia. In fact, I mentioned 2004 when Georgia for the first time sent its troops in South Ossetia. There was no Russian intervention. And the reason why they sent the troops again this time, because, you know, as we heard from the Deputy Georgian Defense Minister, they didn't expect Russia to intervene this time around again. There was an explicit interview, many of you probably read on AFT. And the last issue about this Ossetians living outside of Georgia, that was true. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was 135,000 Ossetians living in Georgia. Only 35 of them, 35,000 in South Ossetia, the rest in the rest of Georgia. When the Georgian first president, Gamsahurdia, came to power and declared the policy of Georgia for the Georgians, ethnic Ossetians were kicked out from everywhere in Georgia. They were at the height of the crisis in '92, 80,000 Ossetian refugees in North Ossetia. And 2 years ago, I, for the first time, brought the Georgian officials to visit those refugee camps. For the first time in 15 years, there's still 40,000 ethnic Ossetians, not from South Ossetia, from Tbilisi, from Barjomi, from Kakheti, who were just expelled from their houses on purely ethnic grounds. They were Ossetians. They were kicked out. Well, this is well documented by UNHCR. If you want me to send you the report from UNHCR, who is actually feeding those people still in the refugee camps. And you know how they live in North Ossetia? They live 3 families in 1 toilet in a pig farm for 15 years.
Okay. If we can go into that, perhaps, a few questions. Sorry, just Pavel, I think we have exhausted the topic of passports in the very short time we have. Can you perhaps address the issue of why the Russians, which one of the questioners asked, why are the Russians being, as he put it, I think that's what he said, you know, obstructive about having independent verification of what's going on inside South Ossetia and Abkhazia?
Well, you mean after the conflict?
Yes.
Now? Well, as far as I'm aware, they are not obstructing whatsoever the United Nations Commission. They are free to go there. But actually, it's now the issue not of the Russian authorities, but of the authorities on the ground. So you can hardly blame Russia for that.
Some people might say, Pavel, that, you know, the authorities on the ground in South Ossetia and Abkhazia are you know, taking their guidance from the Russians. Are you saying the Russians are powerless there?
Well, of course, because it was the Russians who saved them from the pressure and threat of the Georgian invasion. So obviously they are looking up to the Russians as the only power who would defend them. So yes, you could have a link between the Abkhazian and South Ossetian authorities and Moscow. But that's, I believe, if Washington would be as cunning to approach them before that and save them from Saakashvili, well, they could have been much more keen to deal with Washington.
We have the gentleman over there, again, and the lady over there, and the gentleman over there. If you can please keep your questions short, purely because I haven't got that much time. And again, obviously entirely up to you what you ask, but if you do want to expand the questioning beyond Georgia, please do so.
Thank you. Mark Grigoryan, and I would like to, I know what Oksana thinks about my question, so I will direct my question to Roy. And I've spoken to Shamba, the foreign minister of Abkhazia, today. I've interviewed him today, and his interview will be on air tomorrow morning. And I asked him, do you think that the problem is solved with Russia recognizing Abkhazia's independence? He said, yes, the problem is solved. We now think we are secure. The Russian troops are more than welcome to Abkhazia to keep our security from the south. And I asked him, but does it really solve the problem? Because the problem you have is with Georgia. He said, I would like the international community to understand, the more they press over us, the closer we're getting to Russia. So every kind of the pressure that comes from the international community brings us closer and closer to Russia. Now, and just a little point. This war, this conflict in Caucasus was the least bloodiest conflict in Caucasus. You know, during all previous conflicts, we had thousands of people killed and hundreds of thousands refugees. This time the numbers are seriously less. Yes. Now I'm putting this aside back again. So what do you think in these conditions? Well, what would NATO do? Because NATO is now being very seriously pressed from Georgia and Ukraine and from the United States to have these countries as soon as possible members of NATO. Now, what do you think, what will be the decisions and how will the situation with NATO move on?
Well, can we have, that's a pretty valid question, you know, what the future for NATO expanding eastwards? Can we have the lady over there, please?
Thanks. I'm Anna Matveeva. I try to be brief. I disagree that a recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia solved nothing. I think it has forced an issue on the agenda which has been lingering. There are minorities in Europe which found themselves impossible to live with the majority societies, whether they are bad people or good people, it is irrelevant. Albanians could not live with Serbs, we have Ossetians, Abkhazians, maybe they are all bad and ugly, but they found themselves in this like almost ancient Greek tragedy of impossibility of coexisting with people where they have been locked into after the empire's collapse. We have also Northern Cyprus. It is a real problem. Europe has, and European institutions and European policymakers did not address it. My question is, where do we go from there? Kosovo recognition set a train of events in motion when recognition became possible. I understand Georgians. They became desperate. Territories are slipping out of their hands. What seemed to be impossible before Kosovo is now possible. So, are there answers? Secondly, I cannot just pass this Western media responsibility. Of course, correct me if I'm wrong. My sense that Western media was so interested in this tiny place. It's about 60,000 people living in South Ossetia. Half of them are pensioners. Society of Veterans is one of the most important, strongest vocal NGOs in South Ossetia. There are no jobs. People lived largely off smuggling between Georgians and South Ossetians. It is important because it's Russia intervening. Events in Lebanon were unfolding. Nobody picked it. It is because it unleashed now what Russia is going to do next. Threat to Ukraine, threat to Crimea, threat to Karabakh, Russia threat to the world. That makes it exciting and interesting. And is it a responsible thing to do?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And there's a question over there, I think, gentleman in the denim jacket there.
Yes, briefly, Washington's encouragement of Georgia's admission to NATO, if that had not been in the background, how could all of this played out slightly differently over many months or even the last few years? And secondly, does anybody give credence to Putin's comments about a certain presidential candidate and his friendship with the Georgian government and the advantage to his campaign from this series of events?
Thank you. Well, I mean, there's obviously the overwhelming, it seems to me, the thrust of the questions are the future of NATO. What does NATO do with eastward expansion? And a slightly different question, I think, what happens in Europe where it seems that communities can't live together, and we've now got carte blanche because of what happens in the Balkans for countries to succeed. And also, the question at the end about John McCain's links with the Georgian government, and of course Mr. McCain has said that Georgia should join NATO the last time I heard, and so has his running mate Sarah Palin, although some people think she thinks Georgia is a state in the US and not the one in the Caucasus, she's never heard of. So that's a very valid question, of course, and that again, I think taking it to the future. I'm entirely open to who wants to, amongst you, have the first crack. All of you can speak, but who wants to go first? Well, Pavel, you've been going last each time, so perhaps you can give your view.
An interesting point to pick up on how this war was played in the media in terms of the electoral policies. I think that was, I won't dwell into any sort of allegations, whether it was masterminded directly to boost a single candidate's campaign, but it was definitely played very well into a narrative of some, not only in the US. I think that the British politicians tried to exploit the story to their electoral advantage very well. Take alone David Cameron, who was holidaying in the Mediterranean and flew straight to Tbilisi from the holiday to have a photo op with President Saakashvili, and straight after that, the Labour government woke up.
It's the government, it's not me.
Yeah, I was saying about electoral policies, yes. Then the Labour government woke up, and obviously we had there was a competition in who would be harsher in rhetoric towards Russia. Pretty much the same thing happened in the US. So yes, that was used very wisely. And as for the NATO ambitions, I agree with IISS report that Georgia has significantly undermined its potential for the future NATO membership, in the nearest future NATO membership. I think that for the reason I named in my opening remarks in regard to the decay of the US influence, and also the current trends within the European Union, maybe that's the case for the French presidency, but hopefully it will last. Beyond, the European Union is trying to play its hand more hard and more equal to the US, and I think in the future membership for NATO, future NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine may become that kind of a test for the European Union majors and the US to test their skills and might for the future.
Oksana, if you can keep it brief, when Pavel mentioned the ISS report, perhaps you can concentrate possibly on Ukraine, on how you see the prospect of, if Georgia is now out of bounds for NATO for the time being, you think so is the Ukraine?
Well, I mean, it's a long answer. I can't be very brief if you want to ask about, what the NATO strategy should be. But I think it seems to me that in the current situation where we are in such a crisis, it is worthwhile for NATO to keep the cool head and try to think strategically and assess whether in the current environment it would be a net benefit for NATO to see Georgia and Ukraine being initiated on the path towards NATO membership. And that here we have two countries which in one case has just lost the war and 20% of its territory, which it continues to claim to be part of its territory. So obviously bringing Georgia now into NATO means that NATO will inherit the current status quo, which, you know, from my point of view, will continue to reverberate in terms of the security challenge. And is that something which NATO, being committed now in Afghanistan and elsewhere, would like to do? In case of Ukraine, I think the situation is more complicated. I mean, certainly there is a perception in Ukraine now that Russia's intervention in Georgia has presented a certain threat to Ukraine, at least implicit threat. But we've seen recently in several months a debate within the Ukrainian political elite where no consensus was even reached on condemning the Russian actions in Georgia. And I think we still see from the opinion polls that about 80% of the population do not want Ukraine to join NATO. So I think in this environment, again, initiating the process now of Ukraine moving towards NATO would be counterproductive if at least for allowing Ukrainian political establishment some space to be able to finally reach a sustainable political coalition which will be able to deal with the urgent issues which Ukraine requires. So I think NATO should not be motivated in its decision by thinking what, you know, by either giving Russia a veto or to be motivated by, you know, doing something simply because Russians don't like it. So I think we need to take a strategic view. It doesn't mean that in the longer run it is ruled out that Georgia and Ukraine could be members of NATO. In Bucharest there was a very clear commitment on the part of NATO that one day they will be. But certainly now is not the time to start discussing that. I rather agree that the European Union should be the one, now that they have emerged as a key player in the Caucasus and in this facilitating this ceasefire, to actually finding ways to reassure both Ukraine and Georgia that both economically and politically that they will continue on the path towards integration with the West, and the European Union seems to me the right vehicle for that sort of strategy to be put in place. And can I just a very brief comment on Kosovo? I do believe when many officials, you know, around the time of Kosovo unilateral declaration of independence were saying that it's not a precedent. I always thought that it was either ignorance or wishful thinking. There was absolutely no reason why Kosovo was unique. You know, there was all sorts of what Anna mentioned and you know, other people. There were all sorts of, you know, inter-ethnic conflicts which now exist in many parts of Europe and the world, which needs to be addressed. And yes, it is not a precedent in the purely legalistic terms, but how do you explain to people of Abkhazia or South Ossetia that Kosovo can get this recognition while they can't? And they went through many, many years of terrible hardship. So, and I think that is something which put into motion a chain of events which brought us where we are now. So I think it was a big mistake.
Roy, so do you think NATO should forge ahead eastwards? You know, do you think NATO should stand up for, you know, the belief that, you know, as long as these countries fulfill the criteria, they should join?
Yeah, I'll just backpedal to, I think, to the question where the question of frozen conflicts and the status. And here, I think that once the conflict began, then it was clear in the minds of the Russian leadership that they were not intending to go to a status quo ante as far as the peacekeeping arrangements are concerned. Beyond just expelling the Georgian peacekeepers, they were working towards a kind of total solution in political terms, which would have meant logically it moves towards recognition, both for South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And so it has transpired, and I think the local leaderships go then along with that, and quite happy, of course. But to substantiate that, it needs to have Russian support, military support, on a significant scale. So these bases are being established, at least 3,800 troops in each base in each of the republics. Those will have an infrastructure, they'll have whole military settlements around them, and given those numbers, it means that South Ossetia effectively is going to become a kind of barracks province. And Abkhazia, not quite so. It has tourism, it has citrus fruits and so on. But effectively, it will also become a military protectorate. That's the result. Now, for NATO, looking at this, and the reality on the ground is going to be very difficult to reverse. The Georgian view, and I don't represent the Georgian view, on how this affects stability is, well, one view I've heard is that, in a sense, this new reality on the ground with the EU and possibly the OSCE observation missions, a kind of a buffer, means that there'll be greater stability than before, so that the prospect actually of instability which would cause a problem is reduced. Now, I'm agnostic on that. There is the issue of what would have happened if Georgia had got a membership action plan, let's say last year, at the time of this crisis. President Medvedev says he wouldn't have hesitated for a moment to have taken the decision that he did, if he took the decision. My instinct on this is probably the Russian forces would have moved in, but they probably would not have moved beyond the South Ossetian administrative frontier to the south. So that would have been perhaps the effect of the deterrence there. What about the Article 5 commitment? Well, there is going to be a debate about what that actually means for East European NATO members in particular. Poland clearly is not satisfied with the guarantee that is supposed to be in that, and has sought now and obtained explicit US security guarantees with US troops on the ground and so forth. I think that other NATO members, others will also be thinking in these terms. They want to come Article 5 plus. So what could emerge is a two-tier NATO, where some countries have a direct security guarantee from the United States, which is the only country that has a deterrent to actually work, and some do not. So then the question arises, is it from the Russian perspective preferable for Georgia to have that kind of loose Article 5 commitment in NATO, or to seek and obtain a direct security assurance from the United States, bilateral, against an aggression? And all the risks of that involved. I mean, I think these kind of debates are going to start to move. So one shouldn't be thinking of NATO just in the way it has been viewed before. But certainly I think one of the effects of this is going to be a serious debate to sort of reconfigure the core purposes. And with Afghanistan...
Excuse me, what do you mean when you say Georgia? It's very important.
That would, yes, well, then there's the question, the assumption here is that the accession would not depend upon a reintegration, if you like, so that it would be a territorially delimited Georgia still that would be moving towards membership action plan and onwards, with the hope that, sometime ahead that there would be some way of resolving this, but I can't see any way in which it could be resolved.
Damien, if you perhaps you can perhaps address the issue the lady over there raised. It's a very broad issue of is there really any realistic chance of having a state within Europe which has got a number of ethnicities, a number of different sectarian divides, having, we've all covered the Balkans, etc., and obviously it goes back beyond the Balkans, as Oksana points out. Do you think we're going to see much more of this, and do you think it's actually morally right that people who don't want to live together should be allowed to part?
I think there's two ways that these things tend to be handled. One is that people recognize the integrity of the struggle between the two groups, and then there is, to whatever degree, an effort to try and address that, to deal with it, to absorb the anger, to absorb the violence, and after that, try and get people to live together. And then the second approach tends to be to ignore it, and to whatever degree, to whatever proportion that those two apply to all the patchwork of divisions around Europe, which we must recognize and respect in some ways, because that's the difference that people feel. I mean, that's how they're conditioned, that's how they're brought up, that's what they feel they want to express. Now, you can either get heavy engagement, light engagement with it, or you can ignore it, and then you have interference. And somewhere in the amalgam of all that, we will continue to have these things break out. And I think that comes back to the footprint of NATO, and I think it brings us to the point at which we ask, is there a new Cold War? And I think to think of the words new Cold War is deeply not useful, unhelpful, because what we're going to have is fizzy little conflicts that suddenly break out and get very angry and could spill very far in front of themselves. So I think we'll see that pattern. And NATO, having had the security of the Cold War of saying more or less all for one for all, can either retrench back to some core NATO that it can that's still feasible with, or it can have a reasoned debate within itself to figure out what it would do. And therein, I think, is the strategic trap of the history of involving Ukraine and Georgia in NATO, which in principle is probably a good idea because of the orientation of the governments, but it allowed people to exercise willful self-delusion that that was the process and that was the important process, that's the process that's happening, and not really think about what the alternative or the challenges were. And so therefore they were completely unprepared when that was challenged.
One can ask, what is the purpose of NATO in the so-called post-Cold War? I mean, why not, as a visiting American general said rather unfortunately privately last week, offer Russia NATO membership? Why not? It is no longer there as a bulwark against the Warsaw Pact. And of course, perhaps you can, give your opinion on this. There are a lot of people around the world who are quite glad that the Cold War is back, in the sense that there is no longer just one superpower. When I was in Al Jazeera with a Jordanian academic a couple of days ago, and he was saying, fantastic, the Cold War is back. We'll no longer be bullied as much. So, that again is a point of view that perhaps you need to get to address. But the question should be from the floor. So can we have some?
Hi. What implications do you think this war has had on Western interests in Caspian energy reserves? The Caspian at one point being seen as a possible reliable partner, sort of bypassing the Middle East and Russia. Are countries like Azerbaijan going to start looking more towards Russia as a partner than the West? What do you think?
Collecting.
No, just
okay.
Last question.
Just, Oksana, it's for you about the difference between. It will be two questions, but short remark to you answer. But what's the difference between Kosovo and Abkhazia? It's a different. It's a majority from Abkhazia was Georgians and who now are refugees. It's what's the difference? Yeah, about war between. Ethnic war in Ossetia, in Abkhazia, 90s. I was there in Abkhazia, in Ossetia too, that period. And this war was between Georgia and Russia, because all Russian military, all commanders in Abkhazia, in Ossetia was Russians, and there was involved Russian Northern Caucasian people who Russian citizens, and same time Russian aviation attacked Georgian villages in Sukhumi. I was there, and I was attacked too, in Ossetia too, and Abkhazia too. Okay, and questions. What's the difference between Iran and Russia? For a moment when Iran don't have a nuclear bomb or something like that. Now Russian pointing to Europe and sending navy near to United States, maybe with nuclear equipment. I don't know. And one question, and okay, I think it should be enough.
Okay. Anyone else? Just around the back there with the glasses, please.
We've heard a lot about the plight of the Ossetians. I would like to hear from the panel a little bit more about the suffering and misery inflicted on the Georgian population following the Russian invasion. I'm thinking in particular about the killings and pillaging in villages in Georgia, if not by the Russian troops, by the so-called Ossetian militia. And linked with that question, I would like to hear from the panel about what they think as to whether there is any moral or legal justification for the continuing occupation by the Russian military of Georgia, of the other parts of Georgia. In other words, why can't Putin and Medvedev implement the plan that was agreed with President Sarkozy? Because there is no indication that Georgian troops are threatening to take any further military action, whether against Russian troops or against South Ossetia or Abkhazia, which have been illegally taken possession of by Russia.
Well, thank you very much. You've got the three questions there. There's one specifically addressed to you, Oksana. Perhaps we can get to that a bit later. Damien, perhaps you'd care to take the lead this time. Perhaps the last question first. What about the suffering of the Georgians? We saw Georgian refugees in, as you know, north of Gori and from Georgian villages in South Ossetia. Are their plight being underplayed? And secondly, the question of why the Russians continue to be in Georgia. If we can just answer that question.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to remember, and it has to be stated that through commission and omission, Russia oversaw the expulsion and the razing of ethnic Georgian villages in South Ossetia and also in the Kadori Gorge. I don't think it's true that Abkhazian the Georgians in Abkhazia remained intact.
In Gali, all of them remained intact, not a single one left.
Right. But not in the entire territory of Abkhazia.
Not in Kadori, of course. Yeah.
So this act did take place. People suffered. Homes were destroyed. The prospect that they will get back has evaporated. Many cases, these are old people, and in some ways, it's even worse for someone who's 70 to be faced with the reality of living in a tent for the rest of your life, rather than in the home that you've lived in with, mature vines in the front yard. And it's very true that the Russians oversaw that. And to come on to whether that makes a difference between previous wars and the one we've just witnessed, well, no, frankly. And Russia has a responsibility to bear for that.
The Caspian energy question, such a important part of the world's interest in that region. Who would want to answer that on whether or not?
Should I pick up? Well, there are many dimensions to that, but I think that the core issue is just how sustainable is the whole vision of the east-west transport corridor linking the Black Sea to the Caspian region, which is not just pipelines, it's all kinds of communication routes and the expected infrastructure and business that would follow and energize, literally economically, the South Caucasus. The pipelines themselves are clearly, they appear more vulnerable, and when this is a question of investments, which looked at by the risk of investments by investors, obviously the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline is built there. It was temporarily out of action, and by coincidence, a little before this already because of events in Turkey. But for the big investors like BP, the whole investment and commitment now looks in a rather different light to when this commenced last decade. And alongside that, you have the South Caspian gas pipeline, which gives Georgia an independent source of energy, mostly from the very large gas field in the south of the Caspian in the Azerbaijani sector. And it goes beyond that because Kazakhstan, which has the largest new oil field discovered anywhere in the world in the last 20 years, Kashagan, right in the very north of the Caspian, was expecting, really, although it hasn't made this explicit, that part of that output will come south and link in to the South Caucasus route and go westward. It hasn't yet been committed, the oil isn't coming out yet, but it does mean that it has made Kazakhstan nervous as well, because it reduces its options and therefore with reduced options it can't negotiate as well the terms of the with which it will be evacuating oil northward. So Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan and Georgia all feel, and of course Turkey through the receiving end of much of the gas, has to reassess really the risk for the future. It has to be said that the Georgian claims that their attacks on the pipeline were untrue, and both the Russian General Staff and Putin himself have been very explicit that, oh no, we would never attack pipelines, you know, economic objects are not part of our goals. Nonetheless, the vulnerability of those it's not just the Russian attack, but the image of sort of irregular warfare. And of course, this is the only example of significant maneuver warfare in Europe or on the periphery of Europe that we, you know, it's in the post-Cold War period. It's of a different type to the Balkans conflicts, and it was very close to these pipelines. So, and just a sort of final footnote to that. BP also has a large stake in the so-called Caspian Pipeline Consortium from Kazakhstan going north. The terms of that, the negotiations at the moment, from the BP's perspective, are breaking down. So what with their problems with TNK BP with Russia directly, and their uncertainty about the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline south, I think it's been a pretty bad year as far as them and Eurasia is concerned.
Can I just come in one thing up there? I did actually stand in a crater above the pipeline. So Russia demonstrated that it could attack the pipeline. I don't think it intended to blow it up, but it did actually, if there was no reason to hit that terrain otherwise. It just wanted to demonstrate that it could hit that pipeline.
But okay,
well, the Georgians demonstrated that the Russians were intending to hit it.
But did Russia have precision munitions to do that?
Well, they struck from the air.
Well,
so.
it didn't get blown up, so that's the point. So Pavel, so you know, just going on to you, I think if you can answer the Caspian question in sort of more political sense, do you think countries like Azerbaijan will be seeking perhaps a new market, new alliances eastwards rather than westwards? And also, again, briefly, perhaps, you know, the thing which I think we have all seen, the fact that the energy might of Russia has allowed it to be, you know, perhaps behave in a more combative way.
Well, absolutely. Speaking about the Caspian oil and these transit routes, that was actually one of the constants which we were hearing from the Georgian representatives all over the height of this information wars. That point one was that Georgia is the frontier of the Western democracy. The point two was that it is the only lifeline, basically, for the West to get around Russian energy sources. Now, I think that it was obviously not the war about energy for the Russians. No doubt about that. Secondly, over the...
Sorry, why? Can you explain why not about war and...
Well, because of the reasons we were talking here for an hour and a half, that it was actually an ethnic conflict, and the Russians had a political responsibilities to bear and to counter in this conflict, not to inflict any damage on the economic infrastructure and transit routes for Europe. In fact, Russia hasn't threatened, hasn't cut any single delivery to the Western European countries in its history, even since the Soviet Union times. Now, if we come back to the Caspian region, actually, it is a very sensitive point, obviously, for the American administration. That was once again demonstrated by the visit of Vice President Cheney, who went to Baku and Tbilisi. And the interesting fact is that you're absolutely right, Kim, that it's another proof of the decay of the American influence there, is that apparently Vice President Cheney asked the Azerbaijani president to cut his supplies via Russia, because obviously the Azeri resources go two ways, via the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan and also via Russian routes. Now, the Azeri president declined. He said that no, we have to keep our relations with Russia intact. We have our obligations and our interests. Now, I think that's very interesting and very depictive that that meanwhile Russia would respect the Western interests in the transit route and in the Caspian energy bay. I think that the producers themselves and would be much more keen to have more of a balanced position, not the one which was demonstrated by the Georgian government as a transit route. And the second question you wanted to...
So it's very briefly, I mean, this is probably obvious.
I've touched upon the Russian energy commitment to the Western Europe, that Russia hasn't broken a single contract to the Western European recipients. I think that there is definitely a very big dependence of the European Union countries on the Russian oil and gas. But I think it's actually, once used wisely, it's not a threat or not dependence, but it's a very big advantage for Russia and EU to build up a very beneficial relationship in all further economic spheres, because it's actually a very significant interdependence factor, because once supplier, Russia would need a market to sell it, to sell the resources. And obviously you can't find a better customer right now than the European Union countries. So I think here the Europeans should think hard, and I think a lot of countries, the major recipients of Russian energy, have already done that. And we can quote President Sarkozy speaking in the United Nations yesterday that even about some economic sphere which will include both European Union and Russia. So I think that kind of structure would be a warranty for the future, that there would be no that kind of friction, and as we have already picked up on the new Cold War, that there will be less rhetoric about new Cold War, which is not feasible, well, physically intact, like as a phenomenon itself, but it's widely used as a rhetoric tool and electoral policies tool.
Oksana, the question, I think, was one specific question, which was, forgive me if I got it wrong, but I think the thrust of it was the difference between Iran and Russia, the inference being, of course, that Iran hasn't got nuclear weapons, Russia has, and I presume the inference being Iran with nuclear weapons would not be pushed around by the West. And if you want to address that, and then perhaps also you can address the issue, please, Oksana, of energy as a weapon, if indeed such is the case.
Well, I'm actually, I'm afraid I don't really want to answer this question about Russia and Iran being the same, because we all, of course, sitting here know that that's not the case. What I want to answer is what the gentleman there said. And
no, I mean, to be fair, I mean, no, the question was, it was a serious question. The question was, if Iran is now being prevented, the West would like Iran not to have a nuclear weapon, but is it not in Iran's interest to acquire nuclear weapons so that it can stand up to the West? I don't think the question was saying Iran and Russia is the same. I mean, it's obviously, perhaps stating the obvious.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, I suppose Iran has been motivated in its nuclear program for a very long time by a certain sense of insecurity that it felt, and of course, certain isolation that it felt. But I think it is, of course, for the international community, one of the major challenges to deal with, and certainly any durable solution to the Iranian nuclear issue has to come from real cooperation between Russia and the West, because certainly it is obvious that neither European Union nor United States can achieve any success in preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapon without Russia playing an important role. And I think it seems to me that this should be the focus of our relationship at the moment, not the the situation in which we are playing a kind of negative-sum game for such a long time, where our core vital interests, both on the side of Russia and on the side of the West, are now being undermined by the spiral of this totally unnecessary escalation in the relationship, which is not going to lead us anywhere and is not actually presented in a kind of problem-solving strategy. And I very much hope that we're going to be able to return to that in a matter of months, because I suppose next year, for the next US administration, the issue of Iranian nuclear program is going to be the key challenge to be addressed. But if I could just return to this, gentleman, because I do think it is very important. And since I spent so many years working on this peace process, I have as many Georgians I know who suffered as Ossetians. I just feel, since we talked about the origins of the conflict, that oftentimes the Ossetian story is not heard in the West. But I want to say that I deeply sympathize with the Georgian people. I think their governments repeatedly, led them to the situation where now every 11th citizen of Georgia is a refugee or internally displaced person. Every 11th citizen who lives in Georgia. And that is a tragic history that Georgia had after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The first Georgian president, Gamsahurdia, had moved the troops into South Ossetia. Then we had the second iteration, the movement towards started war in Abkhazia. Now again, at the time of the potential prosperity for Georgia, we have again the Georgian leadership which started this war. And I feel that this is a terrible tragedy for Georgian people that they have to now deal with. We have enormous amount of Georgian refugees, of course, who were expelled from Abkhazia, 220,000. We have now the Georgian refugees who now have been expelled from South Ossetia. I believe all of them have to return. And I believe that every person who suffered from all of those conflicts have to be given a right to return. To the Ossetians who were expelled from the rest of Georgia, to the Georgians. But the problem is that we have now the chain of events which, carried on or continued now for more than a decade, whereby this return is becoming less and less possible. I spoke to the Georgian refugees from Abkhazia, who actually had some hope, several years ago to return. What happened in the last month have finished this hope for them and their generation, I'm afraid. There is no possibility at the moment to see the Georgians returning to Abkhazia beyond Gali. And I think our aim should be to see Georgians staying in Gali and Georgians returning to Kadori. But I think, it is very hard now in the current environment to envision. And I think the Georgian government had let their people down. And going back to this issue of, whether it is war with Russia, with all due respect, I think it is easy for the Georgians and very noble for them to present the situation as they always are fighting Russia. That sounds very good, Georgians are fighting Russia. But don't you at all prepared to recognize that in all of those 3 wars that Georgia had and lost, Georgia started those wars. Russia helped them to lose that. But if you were in Tskhinvali and in Abkhazia during the first wars, no, but this is very essential. This is very essential because if the Georgian government continues to start wars against the ethnic minorities over and over again, repeatedly for 15 years, how could you imagine in this environment we can have sustainable peace where Georgian refugees can return? How can you imagine that they can return now in Abkhazia, where we had again another incident of ethnic cleansing, of the violence and wars? We will require again generations of people who would go over it to be able to trust each other. It's very hard to put now the new generations of Ossetians and the new generations of Georgians together and make them accept that they need to live together in one country. This is just not going to happen. And therefore, I think the international community should certainly help do everything possible for the Georgian refugees, for the Georgian IDPs. They have to support them. And there's about 30,000 now Georgian IDPs who are considered to be not able to immediately return. But I think it is the effort which certainly is now going to be very difficult to achieve, much more difficult than it was 3 or 4 months ago. Unfortunately, that's just the situation we have. But the suffering, of course, were immense on all sides. And I think in that sense, Georgian people were betrayed by their government that started something which inevitably would lead to what happened now. And of course, Russia carries responsibility too, being there, at the time when the fighting was going on. But I think it was essential in inter-ethnic fighting, and the expulsions that happened were not done by the Russian troops. They were done by the Ossetian militias, as we all know. And we need now Russia and international community working together to make this sure these people can return. And I think they will.
Thank you very much indeed. That's all we have got time for, I'm afraid, sadly. I'll just ask the audience just one question. How many of you think that you know, what happened in Georgia was one isolated incident and things will move on as before? How many of you think that, you know, Georgia has come and gone and it will not have any repercussions or serious repercussions in the future?
What's the alternative?
No, that's fairly obvious. One question would be, you know, do you think Georgia is the beginning, if you like, of a kind of a domino effect with more of the Caucasus having degrees of violence?
All part of Russia.
Sorry, all parts of what Russia? I mean, all right. Let me just, you know, another convoluted question. How many of you think that we're going to see more incidents like the Georgian conflict in the future? Right. Among the panel, I don't want any answers, just hands. How many of you think that this will lead to more conflicts in the future?
I would actually go, well, if the current world order sticks, then we will have more of them.
No, I think Nagorno-Karabakh is one of the major concerns because it is a conflict which, if escalating, you know, could lead to a much greater humanitarian catastrophe than this kind of conflict. But it looks like that all the lessons that Azerbaijan and Armenia have learned from the current crisis is that attempting to undertake a military solution would only lead to deadlock. And I think it seems to me that we just had the foreign minister of Azerbaijan at the ISS a few days ago. They simply hope, they now hope that after this conflict there will be better chance that Nagorno-Karabakh conflict will be resolved rather than less. And I think this is very promising.
Very briefly, guys, what do you think, Damien? Do you think we'll see more of this? You'll be going up there again?
Well, I think if the stock market keeps crashing after each time it happens, then the prime constituency of the Russian leadership will be less and less tolerant of these things.
And again, very briefly, Roy, what do you think? Do you think it's a precursor of things to come, or do you think it's a little local difficulty which has come and gone?
To the extent that coercive diplomacy on the Russian side played a role in this, I think that will come to characterize Russian policy more in the coming years. Whether that will have a military dimension will depend upon the locality, the response, and also really the overall state of East-West relations. But I think that that's already been signalled strongly by statements made by the top Russian leadership.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think Deborah has made absolutely clear it's now the end of the affair. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks for coming.